I want to point out a chart that caught my eye today. You may be familiar with it. This shows the gains that we've seen in traditional automakers here in orange have held their heads above water, but EV specialists in white have just shot up. And of course, we've seen this with the biggest name in the industry, Tesla, but we're starting to see investors put massive faith in terms of buying shares of Volkswagen after Herbert Diess put forward their electric strategy. Why do you think this is overblown? Why do you think it's a delusion?
Well, firstly, let me define big market delusion. This is a term coined by Brad Cornell, a former professor from both UCLA and Caltech. But it's an idea that's familiar territory for a lot of investors. Back in the heady days of the tech bubble, every stock was priced as if they were all going to be winners. And yet they were competing against one another. They couldn't possibly all be winners. At the trough of the financial crisis, every financial services company was priced as if it was at immediate risk of bankruptcy. And yet every bankruptcy would clear the landscape for the survivors to prosper. So big market delusion means you take a segment of the market and you have this delusion. It's not just an illusion, it's a delusion that everything is going to succeed in parallel or everything's going to flounder in parallel. And the EV market is a perfect example of that. There's 8 EV specialists in the world. Tesla is by far the largest, but at its peak, it was 30 times annual sales, 30 times the annual total revenues of the company. And it was the second cheapest of the 8 companies, the second cheapest. Good gracious.
But
yeah.
Rob, how do you explain that? I mean, even after losing a little bit of its luster, Tesla is still a $600 billion company. And I've heard bulls make arguments that it's not just about cars. It's a software company. It's a tech company. I don't know if it's a lifestyle. What could possibly be behind a $600 billion valuation for Tesla?
The $600 billion valuation, as with any bubble, it's built on a narrative, and the narrative has a lot of truth to it. Is Elon Musk a visionary? Yes. Is the electric vehicle surge going to be taking over much of the auto industry in the coming 20 years? Yes, especially as autonomous vehicles come on stream. They're going to wind up, when they're not occupied by customers, going to a charging station, automatically driving themselves there and getting charged up. Hard to do that with a gas pump. And so electric vehicles are the future, but are the EV specialists the only winners out of this? The other surprise that to us proves that this is a big market delusion is that the EV makers from the March lows went up nearly tenfold by the time of their peak. And during that same time, the traditional automakers very nearly doubled. The traditional automakers, if they're being squeezed out, no, they're not being squeezed out. They're shifting to electric, and we're seeing that.
So you don't think that it's necessarily a big market delusion to see a run-up in shares of other car makers who get into this, to get into producing electric vehicles? I'm based here in Germany, so I see Daimler now getting into it finally. Yep. I see BMW as a front runner and then kind of gave up for a while, it seemed. Volkswagen has now really put its money where its mouth is. But you don't have a problem with gains in those shares necessarily as a big market delusion because they're still valued at very little. Small PEs when it comes to Tesla, right? You can't compare a 14 of Volkswagen to an unlimited of Tesla.
That's exactly right. I mean, do I think the traditional automakers have some major catching up to do? Of course they do. Do I think they have the resources to catch up? Of course they do. And who will be the winners in this fierce competition? I would be very hesitant to write off Tesla as one that won't survive. But 30 times annual sales at its peak, when the traditional automakers are on average about 1 times sales. So if Tesla triples its production and the price goes nowhere, it's only down to 10 times sales. And if the traditional automakers ramp up their electric production and rise to 2 times sales, you still have a 5-to-1 ratio to justify, which is huge.